Okay, I'm finally back. I've won my battle with Comcast for now, but of course, you never win the war. I do have internet finally, so I am going to be able to upload something today, so there's that. But I don't have a happy topic to talk about. As we all know, cost of living going up a lot in America lately. Part of that's inflation, part of that might be other things. Um, there are supply chain issues that are separate from money printing. And one clear example is beef. Beef is higher not just because of inflation from the government running massive deficits and printing a lot of money. Beef is more expensive right now because there's a bottleneck in meatpacking. If you talk to ranchers, hell, I was talking to relatives of mine that are cattle ranchers last year even, and beef was getting pretty expensive, yet their profits, the ranchers, kept going down and down. And it's really hard to make a living right now as a cattle rancher because there is a glut of cattle, but a dearth of beef. And so you might scratch your head as a layman and say, well, gee, how can that be? All the ranchers are flush with cattle, yet I'm paying more than ever for a hamburger at Walmart. And the answer is that the answer to the way you square that circle is by looking at meatpacking, which is not the most exciting topic in the world, but it's something that the Biden administration has cited as an explanation. And I have to say, it's not. It's a double. There's two sides to this story. There's a bull and a bear case, I guess you could say, for blaming the meatpacking industry for the current price of beef. Now, the explanation offered by the Biden administration is about as low IQ as you would expect. They just said, well, it's just greed. You see, that just all of a sudden this year, after Biden was elected, the meat packers got really greedy. And that's why beef is expensive and the ranchers aren't making any money. It's just greed. That's, because sometimes you see the meat packers are greedy and other times they're not greedy at all. For who knows? And how do all the meat packers know to be greedy at the same time? You would think that if this is just an emotion and sometimes they feel greedy and sometimes they don't, that the different meat packers would, would kind of just do that on their own. Not all at once, okay, all of a sudden we're going to drive beef up. So I think the greed explanation doesn't quite make sense. Now, something that would make a little more sense is that there's not a whole lot of competition in meatpacking. There's a lot of cattle ranchers in America. There's a lot of individual people and companies who raise cattle and who, sell them into the industry to be processed for beef, but don't sell the beef, wholesale to the grocery stores. There are, a few companies that process all the animals, that slaughter them and cut them up and package them, and those are the meat packers. It used to be in America that there was, small meat packers in every town. That was a part of, the local economies. You had a butcher who killed and cut up all of the livestock for meat. These were mom and pop shops back when people ate food that was all grown and raised locally. When back in the days when a rancher would service his local community and those were the people who he was selling his meat to, he would take it to the local meat packer. It would be packaged. It would go into the store, or however they distributed it back then. In the around 1900 or so, it would get sold to the restaurants and whatnot. And a part of the pure, I guess you'd call it the pure food movement. I can't remember exactly what it was called. It was also tied up with evangelical Christianity at the time, and different special interest groups. It was a whole mess that led to the Pure Food and Drug Act and the creation of the Food and Drug Administration in the U.S. Department of Agriculture and all of this, agricultural bureaucracy and food bureaucracy that we deal with today. And there was a lot. There was a lot that went into that. You had Christian groups that wanted to outlaw any sort of artificial flavoring or lab-made chemicals going into foods. because they thought that was unholy. It wasn't the way that God raised it. They thought that if you use any chemicals in foods, that is essentially sacrilegious. Then you had people like the sorghum farmers who wanted to market sorghum for sugar, and they wanted to outlaw saccharin, which was sweet and low, I believe, is saccharin. It's a low calorie alternative sweetener to sugar. And then of course you had Upton Sinclair and his demonic, disastrous book, The Jungle, in which he writes about how bad the meatpacking industry is and how the federal government needs to clean it up. And what did the federal government do to clean up the meatpacking industry? Well, the federal government essentially turned it into an oligopoly. They imposed high fixed costs on meatpackers, put all the local meatpackers out of business, and created a space for these big meat consortiums like Cargill Foods to come in and to pay those high fixed costs in order to get their foot into the door of the meatpacking industry and then control almost the entire market. And so with little to no competition in the meatpacking industry, the meatpackers hold a stranglehold on the entire market. And they can really, at their whim, it's up to them what the ranchers get paid and what the consumers have to pay. Because your choice is you pay whatever price they demand for the beef that they process, or you eat pork. And in economics, it's not studied too much anymore, but you used to study the beef to pork ratio. How much of someone's diet were they consuming beef versus pork? And the more pork they were consuming, that was an indication of impoverishment. The more that someone ate beef, they were considered to be more well off, because that was the idea. Well, if you couldn't afford beef, you would substitute that with pork. And that really is your only option if you don't want to pay whatever price the big meat packers decide to set. But this, and the Biden administration is acting like this is a new problem. Like this is something that just started this year. Oh, well, the meat packers, they just decided this year that they're going to be greedy. No, this has been the case for over a century. There is no competition in meatpacking. Ranchers get paid whatever the meatpackers want to pay them, and consumers pay whatever the meatpackers want to be paid. There is pretty much no competition. Like I said, if you don't like the price they pay, you can go eat pigs. So this is a problem that was, it's not even a problem. It's not an unintended consequence. This is, by design, what the government policy was intended to do and what current government policy is intended to do. This is the whole point of what the FDA does and having USDA inspection. But for whatever reason, I guess because politically it's not looking good for them, the Biden administration has decided this is a bad thing. And so what are they going to do about it? Are they going to lower those high fixed costs to allow competition into the meatpacking industry, to make it possible for new upstart companies to move into that space and try to compete with the big guys and, serve their local communities? No, they're not going to do any of that. They're apparently just going to appropriate $1 billion in the Wu Flu Recovery Fund, and I guess use it to subsidize, quote-unquote independent meat packers. So we're just going to give $1 billion in subsidies to, I guess, what little competition there is in the meatpacking industry, which is going to do pretty much nothing. It's not going to bring in new meat packers. I guess the idea is, well, he wants the small, what small meat packers exist, he wants them to be bigger. Okay. Well, these companies would be able to grow on their own if they weren't choking under the FDA and the USDA. And the FDA is a part of, it's an agency within the U.S. Department of Agriculture, so that's why I kind of using the terms interchangeably. So the solution to this, if you want beef to be a lot cheaper and you want the ranchers not to go out of business, because, of course, what is the end result of that? Remember, we're in the era of the Great Reset. They put the smallest ranchers get put out of business the quickest. Their small land holdings get bought up by, corporate farmers, and these big multinationals and foreigners and billionaires like Bill Gates, who's the largest landholder in America, and their land is just taken out of circulation, for forever. So what they need is the legal ability to market their beef, to be able to sell it themselves without having to go through people like Cargill Foods or these other big meat packers. They should be able to, pack it themselves if they want to, hire people to cut it up, without that silly USDA stamp of approval, because that is what costs so much, is having that stamp. And does that make your, if you don't have that, does that mean that your beef is, deadly poison? No. These operations, if you allow small meat packers to blossom up, they're going to have to convince people, if they don't have that USDA stamp of approval, that their meat is safe to eat. And they will probably, well, certainly, come up with a much better way of demonstrating that than whatever the USDA does. Because they have different incentives. These folks, their incentive will be to make money and to deliver beef to the market. The USDA's goal, their incentive, is to sit around all day and collect a paycheck and serve the meatpacking industry and keep out competition. That's what the USDA has always done. That's what they were created to do. And so we really could completely revolutionize the market for beef in this country overnight if they just did away with that. If you just said, hey, the government doesn't have to change anything. They can keep the USDA inspections the way they are now. Just say you don't need that, and allow people to come up with their own ways of trying to prove that their meat is safe and good. I mean, it's just like the whole raw milk scandal. Remember, raw milk is illegal in a lot of places. You're not allowed to drink milk if it's unpasteurized, even though people drank unpasteurized milk for thousands of years. Pasteurization wasn't invented until the 1890s. No, I'm not a raw milk fan. I never drank it. It seems kind of gross to me. But then again, regular milk is kind of gross to me. I use milk in cooking. I use cream in cooking. I use dairy products. I don't really like drinking milk itself. But that's just me. Anybody who wants to should be able to drink raw milk, just like you should be able to, eat beef that hasn't passed, by the, some munchkin with a clipboard and a USDA badge. Because I think we're much less healthy now. I think, I don't think that's going to be too controversial of an opinion. I think Americans are less healthy now with the USDA and all this crap in place, because it's led to the centralization of all this. You don't have a local rancher that who produces the meat that you're eating, who has a reputation. It's all nameless, faceless people. They sell, they have to sell their beef up the chain into these big conglomerates, and then it goes through, a meat grinder, a literal meat grinder, and all the meat in the country gets blended together, and then redistributed out again. And so we end up with this very fragile centralized system where if there's anything that goes wrong, along that chain, the whole country has to suffer. Whereas we would have a much more durable market if this was much more decentralized and localized. If there's a problem processing meat, where there's a labor shortage or something in one town, maybe it only affects that town instead of affecting the whole country. Sure, that town might need to start, buying beef from surrounding areas, but that meatpacking operation, is going to represent a pretty small percentage of the national beef supply. Whereas you have now, any given meatpacking operation represents a substantial quantity of the supply of beef in this country. And so at times like this, when you see a clear market imbalance where cattle are plentiful and processed meat is scarce, this is when you would expect somebody to start a new business and say, hey, I can make money there. I can fill that gap. But you can't because of the high fixed costs. There are barriers to entry that you're not going to be able to overcome. And that's why nobody enters into this market, or else you would see people investing in meatpacking. You wouldn't, you don't need Uncle Joe. Uncle Joe thinks, you know what? Here's a problem. People aren't investing in meatpacking. I should do that because I'm a much smarter investor than all these folks. And say what you will about the Wall Street folks. I think that they're borderline subhuman. Not fans of them. I do think that they're vampires. But they know a lot more about investing than Joe Biden. I'll give them that. There, theoretically, should be money to be made in the meatpacking industry. And the banks would be throwing money at anyone who wanted to if it weren't for Joe Biden's barriers to entry. I don't even want to call them Joe Biden's barriers to entry. They're Teddy Roosevelt's barriers to entry. They're, Franklin Roosevelt's barriers to entry. They're Dwight Eisenhower's barriers to entry. They're Richard Nixon's barriers to entry. They're Donald Trump's barriers to entry. Every president has presided over this and has, every president since pretty much Teddy Roosevelt has presided over the cartelization and the concentration of American industry across the board. No matter how many times people, want to call Teddy Roosevelt a trust buster, it's a myth. It's a fairy tale. Like, grow up. Your 8th grade history textbook, I hate to break it to you, there's some stuff in there that's not quite accurate about American history. And one of the things that you don't get taught in school is that Teddy Roosevelt was a corporate shill. He was bought and paid for by J.P. Morgan. That was his master. That's who he listened to. And so, sure, he took on the Rockefellers because Rockefeller was from Ohio. J.P. Morgan was from New York. He was a patron of Teddy Roosevelt. And so, sure, he would be happy to go after Standard Oil, but he would never touch International Harvester or any of J.P. Morgan's monopolies. U.S. Steel, yeah, you're not going to see Teddy Roosevelt touching it with a 10-foot pole. And so, American presidents, American leaders, the federal government in general, very happy to promote cartels and monopolists. And that is part of the reason why the cost of living in America is as high as it is. Meatpacking, I think, is just one of the most easy to perceive and obvious examples. If you look at it for more than 5 minutes and you have an IQ somewhere above 70. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow, hopefully, assuming the internet still works.